Providing enough water for plants is an essential part of growing food, and this is especially the case with growing vegetable plants. Here in Ireland, we usually don't have to worry about this most of the time, as there is generally enough rain for a lot of the year, sometimes too much rain. But we do get some really dry periods where additional watering or irrigation definitely improves the growth of vegetable plants. And of course, irrigation is essential in a polytunnel as the plastic keeps out all of the rain. And with the warmer microclimate that is created, this leads to more evaporation and transpiration, and therefore a lot more watering is needed. Over the years, I've used a number of different methods to get more water into the soil of the polytunnels that I manage, and into the soil of the outside gardens as well. And I still use all of these different methods, but some of them are definitely easier than others. I grow vegetables in a context where there is easy access to municipal water supplies throughout the year, water that is clean and fairly cost and energy efficient. With a supply like this, the simplest way to get water into the vegetable gardens is to use a hose and a nozzle and let the water pressure and the hose do the work of moving the water around the gardens. This can be an effective way of easily directing the water to where it's needed, and with a good quality sprayer, it can be quite gentle for the plants. Beyond the potential damage that can be done to the plants by dragging the hose through the gardens, the main drawback is the time that it takes to get the amount of water that is needed into the soil. There is also the issue of wetting the leaves of some of the plants, and that a greater proportion of the water will be lost through evaporation rather than getting into the soil. And the water can be quite cool and also contains chlorine, which I'd really rather not be adding to the soil. But the main reason that I tend not to rely on this method very much is that there is low pressure and flow of water on the site due to a problematic connection that I haven't got around to fixing yet. The lower water pressure and flow has been a bit of a hassle in the gardens, and even worse when more people are trying to use the same supply during the dry periods. The way that I've been able to get around this in the past is by filling up large tanks with water and using watering cans to distribute the water into the gardens. Filling up a pair of watering cans from a strategically positioned tank meant that I could get a lot more water into the garden beds much quicker than with a hose, and then I could let the tanks fill up again while I did other tasks in the gardens. This took a lot less time compared to standing there with a hose, but it still took a while, and it's definitely more physical effort for me. But hauling 2 watering cans around is a great way to develop upper body strength. In addition to having large volume of water available whenever I needed it, the water also had a chance to warm up, and some of the chlorine has a chance to off-gas. And having a few large tanks of water inside the polytunnel also provides a substantial thermal mass, absorbing the heat during the day and keeping the space a bit warmer overnight. Even though I now use other labor-saving irrigation methods for most of the watering of the crops, I still keep at least 1 tank full of water around the gardens, as I found that this is the easiest and most convenient way to water small areas of the gardens, especially to make sure that recent sowings and transplants have consistent soil moisture. A few years ago, I installed an overhead sprinkler irrigation system in my older polytunnel, and this definitely made a big difference in the amount of work that it took to water this enclosed garden. I estimate that it saved me about 30 to 40 hours of work throughout the full year, time that I would otherwise have spent hauling watering cans around, and that was a very welcome change. These 2 lines of sprinklers are a great way to be able to get lots of water into the space, and I've noticed fewer issues with the health of some of the plants, and I think that this is because I'm able to maintain better soil moisture levels throughout the growing season. Now I can simply let the sprinklers run for as long as I need to, and I can really saturate the soil with the water if necessary, including the paths between the growing beds, which used to end up being very dry when I was watering only the growing beds by hand. The low water pressure can sometimes be an issue, with the spray and coverage not very effective at times, but it's fairly easy to work around, especially if I water in the evening or early morning, which I suspect is a better option anyway. The biggest issue or limitation with the sprinklers is that I grow a lot of tall plants in this polytunnel during the summer, which get in the way of the sprinkler heads, and apparently plants like tomatoes don't like to get their leaves wet. And the sprinklers definitely increase the humidity in this enclosed space, which can be a problem. A few years ago, I also invested in a line of sprinklers on the end of spikes that are pushed into the ground for use in the outside gardens. I was looking for a better option than hauling large amounts of water around by hand during these dry periods, and this one line of sprinklers really helped. I thought I would end up buying a lot more sprinklers to cover a full area or a few of the gardens, but I found that it was fairly easy to roll up this one line of sprinklers and move it around to other positions in the gardens. By moving it every hour or so, I could gradually water all of the 5 outside gardens over several days. The few minutes that it took to reposition the line each time was a bit of a hassle, but much less than the effort to water by hand. But considering that I usually only need to use it for several weeks during most growing season, I think it makes sense to move this one line around rather than invest in a lot more pipes and sprinklers and end up having to work around them or to store them for most of the year. The biggest issue that I have with these small sprinklers is that they are too low to the ground and become less effective once the plants get taller, but I am looking at ways to set them higher. The weather conditions here in the Midlands of Ireland make more permanent or extensive watering infrastructure less viable in the outside gardens, at least at the scale that I'm growing at. But I'm really glad to have this one line of sprinklers to help keep enough moisture in the soil during those occasions when the amount of rainfall is just not enough. When I put up my larger polytunnel a few years ago, I had installed a drip line watering system as the main irrigation method from the start. I laid out pipes with regularly spaced drippers along the length of the polytunnel, with 3 or 4 pipes on each of the fixed beds. The ends of the pipes were connected so that each bed could be turned off or on independently, which makes it easier to add the water where it's necessary, and to only water 1 or 2 of the beds at a time when the water pressure is an issue. This drip line system has a lot of the same benefits of the sprinkler system, especially in saving time and effort, but it does have the benefit of adding water to the soil without getting the plants wet or increasing the humidity in the polytunnel. The main downside of this system is that the pipes are in the way of managing the plants and preparing the growing beds, but the effort to remove or push aside these pipes is very small compared to the effort of hand watering. There is also an issue with the top surface of the soil between the drippers not getting enough water. While I don't necessarily want the surface of the soil to be wet all the time, I've found that a significant volume of the soil can dry out between the pipes, which is made worse by the fairly free-draining sandy loam soil that I have, where the water tends to flow down into the soil more than it does horizontally. The dry areas that form are also not very compatible with the minimum tillage strategy that I've been using in this garden, where I apply the compost and amendments to the surface of the soil and don't till it in very deeply. So unless I also use another method to maintain sufficient moisture on the top layers of this full bed, then the plants won't have access to all of the available soil fertility that I add. As with many things, I've found that no single method of watering is ideal, as each method has its own limitations as well as benefits. This season I installed a full drip line system into my older polytunnel, in addition to the existing sprinkler system, for use mainly during the summer when the plants get too tall, and I plan to install an overhead sprinkler in the larger polytunnel that has had only a drip line for the past few years. I think these two methods work well in combination in these enclosed spaces, with the sprinklers able to water the full space including the paths and to keep the upper parts of the soil moist. And the drip line is great for the deep watering of the beds during the summer when the tall plants make the sprinklers less effective. The added expense of the two systems is worth it in my opinion, as one complements the other, and they can both save a lot of work in this high-value growing space. But I still use a hose and nozzle occasionally, and rely on watering cans for most of the spot watering and for topping up the soil moisture in patches missed by the drip line systems. For the outside gardens, the rain does most of the work, most of the time, backed up by me with the watering cans for occasional use, and sometimes I drag out the hose. But I tend to only bring out the line of ground sprinklers when the rain isn't reliable, and this season I've only used it on 2 occasions. I know that there are other methods of watering that I can use in the gardens, but for now this set works well for me. Once I get around to fixing the issue with the lower water pressure, I plan to install timers for the watering systems in the polytunnels, which will further automate the process, and with enough pressure, I can water all of the beds at once. And once the pressure is more reliable, I can also buy in another line or 2 of ground-based sprinklers for the outside gardens, to speed up the process of watering all the gardens when necessary. But I think that the climate will have to change quite a bit before I would invest in more permanent water infrastructure for all of these gardens. I also plan to capture water off of the polytunnel plastic, and then to use this more natural source for watering the inside of the space, rather than relying on the municipal supply. This will require installing gutters for collecting water and then ponds and tanks for storing the water, as well as pumps and filters to make sure that the debris does not get in to block the drip line pipes or the sprinklers. And it will also require an electricity supply, which I currently don't have in the gardens, so I plan to install solar panels and batteries in order to be able to run these pumps. But I do wonder if all this extra infrastructure and equipment is really worth the effort, especially given the apparent reliability of the municipal water supply. But I plan to explore it anyways, in order to build in some resilience and redundancy into the food growing systems that I manage. As I've discovered over the years, it's always better to have several different ways to supply such essential resources in the gardens, especially as we head into an uncertain future.